Welcome to Life Stories. What would you do if you spent 8 years building a company from the ground up, only to be told it was never really yours? Madeline Lancaster gave up a thriving finance career to save her family's struggling business, turning it into a national success. But just when she thought she had earned her place, her parents had other plans. Her brother would be CEO. Would she walk away, or fight for what she had built? Stay with us as we unfold this powerful story of ambition, betrayal, and self-worth. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. The crystal glasses clinked in the soft glow of candlelight, echoing through the private dining room at Waverly's, Boston's most exclusive restaurant. The air buzzed with warmth and quiet satisfaction. A moment of celebration nearly a decade in the making. I watched as Edward Kingston, the lead investor from Meridian Capital, lifted his glass, his expression one of genuine enthusiasm. To Lancaster Fine Foods in this exciting new chapter, he declared. The toast was met with murmurs of approval. Champagne flowed freely, hands reached across the table in congratulations. And for the first time in years, my parents looked truly happy. I should have felt victorious. 8 years ago, I had walked away from a 6-figure career in finance to rescue my family's struggling gourmet shop. Everyone thought I was reckless, even foolish, to leave behind the security of Wall Street for a failing storefront. But I had seen something others hadn't, a future where our handcrafted preserves and artisanal condiments weren't just a small-town indulgence but a national brand. Madeline, you've built something extraordinary. Vivian Carter, my former business professor, said warmly. She was the one who had introduced me to the investors. And without her guidance, I wouldn't be sitting at this table today. I still remember your parents' little shop in Cambridge. And now, national distribution. A booming e-commerce platform. Manufacturing partnerships. It's remarkable. I smiled, allowing myself to bask in the validation for a fleeting moment. The journey had been relentless. I had restructured operations, rebranded the entire product line, secured partnerships, and built our e-commerce presence from scratch. The shop my parents had opened 25 years ago had been transformed from a quaint local favorite into a thriving national brand, with our products now shipping to 48 states. I glanced at my father, who sat beside me with an uncharacteristic look of pride. None of this would have happened without Madeline's vision, he said, raising his glass again. When Helen and I started this business, we never imagined it would become what it is today. My mother nodded, smiling, but I caught a flicker of something else in her expression, a hesitation, a thought unspoken. And then, as if the moment had been waiting to break, she turned to me and leaned in, her perfume familiar, comforting, yet somehow suffocating. Madeline, dear, she whispered, her hand slipping into mine under the table. This is all very exciting. But when Ethan returns next month, it'll be time for him to take over as CEO. You've done such wonderful groundwork. But he has the right education for this next phase. A wave of cold settled deep in my stomach. Ethan, the golden child, my brother, the one who had spent the past year traveling through Europe after completing his MBA from Wharton, had barely checked in on the business I had been rebuilding with my blood, sweat, and tears. I tightened my grip on my mother's hand, forcing a smile onto my lips. Everything okay? Kingston asked from across the table, catching the subtle exchange. Absolutely perfect, I replied, raising my glass a little higher. But inside, the walls of my carefully built reality trembled. 8 years of sacrifice, 18-hour days, missed vacations, personal life, non-existent, and still, I was seen as the temporary caretaker of Ethan's birthright. The past rushed back like an old wound being reopened. I had been a rising star at Morgan Stanley when my father called one evening, his voice heavy with worry. The business was failing. They had overextended on a second location, and the recession had hit luxury food items hard. They were 3 months from closing their doors. You're leaving finance to sell fancy jam? My boss had asked, laughing in disbelief when I handed in my resignation. Even Ethan had questioned me at the time. It's a sinking ship, Maddie, let it go and find them something else to do. But I couldn't. Lancaster Fine Foods wasn't just a shop, it was my parents' legacy. I had grown up watching them carefully craft recipes, source ingredients from family-run farms, and build real connections with every customer who stepped through the door. Walking away from my finance career wasn't just about saving a business, it was about preserving something deeply personal. The first 2 years were brutal. I worked the front counter by day, crunching numbers at night. I sold the second location, renegotiated supplier contracts, modernized accounting systems, and took out a second mortgage on my condo to fund our first e-commerce platform. I slept on a cot in the stockroom for 6 months when I could no longer afford both my mortgage and rent. Ethan? He graduated and took an entry-level position at a consulting firm, offering occasional advice from the sidelines but never stepping in to help. My parents never seemed to mind. He's gaining valuable experience, they'd say, as if my experience, rebuilding the company from the ground up, meant less than the theoretical knowledge he was acquiring elsewhere. But despite their ambivalence, I had transformed the business. One viral blog post led to a subscription box service that gained 20,000 monthly subscribers. Strategic partnerships with national gourmet grocery chains increased revenue by 340%. And yet, no matter what I achieved, there was always an underlying, "This is temporary," in their praise. Ethan would take over eventually. That was the unspoken truth. The family assumption that no amount of my success seemed to change. As the investors continued discussing expansion plans I had meticulously crafted, I felt my mother's eyes on me, waiting for my quiet acceptance of the inevitable. But something inside me shifted. For years, I had convinced myself that if I worked hard enough, proved myself enough, then they would see, they would finally recognize my worth. But now, sitting at this table, I realized the truth. They never would. And suddenly, Monday morning couldn't come fast enough. I barely slept that night. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying my mother's words in my head like a broken record. When Ethan returns next month, it'll be time for him to take over as CEO. Not a suggestion, a decision, already made, without me. By the time dawn broke, I was sitting at my desk in the empty Lancaster Fine Foods headquarters, surrounded by spreadsheets, market analyses, and years of documentation. I had built this company, brick by brick, while Ethan had been traveling, learning about wine in France and attending lectures in London. And yet, in my parents' eyes, he was still the rightful heir. The absurdity of it stung. As I sipped my third coffee of the morning, a voice interrupted my thoughts. "Miss Lancaster, everything okay?" I looked up to see Jorge, our head of maintenance, standing in the doorway, a concerned expression on his face. He had been with us since I took over, quietly keeping the building running through every late night and chaotic expansion. "Just preparing for a big meeting," I replied, forcing a smile. "Another one?" He chuckled. "After that fancy dinner last night? You work too hard, you know." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "This one's important. Maybe the most important meeting I've ever had." He nodded, seemingly understanding more than I had said. "Good luck, Miss Lancaster." As he walked away, I reached for my phone and made a call I had been avoiding for months. "Madeline, it's 6:30 on a Saturday," came the groggy voice of Vivian Carter, my former professor and closest mentor. "I need your advice," I said without preamble, "and possibly your help." 45 minutes later, she walked through my office door, 2 coffees in hand, a look of quiet determination on her face. After I explained the situation, she sat back and studied me carefully. "You've been anticipating this moment for years," she finally said. "What do you really want, Madeline?" The question lingered in the air. Recognition? Validation? The CEO title that I had already been performing for years? Or something else entirely? "I want what I've earned," I said at last, "and I want to stop pretending that my family values my contribution when they don't." Vivian nodded. "Then let's make some calls." By noon, I had spoken with Kingston and arranged an emergency meeting with the investment team for Sunday morning. I also called my loyal employees, Daphne from marketing, Jason from operations, and Tamara from product development, asking them to come in for an urgent strategy session. These were the people who had been with me from the beginning, who had built this company alongside me while Ethan was off finding himself. My parents called twice, eager to discuss exciting ideas Ethan had for the business. I let the calls go to voicemail. This weekend wasn't about Ethan. This was about securing my future, with or without Lancaster Fine Foods. Sunday morning arrived with a quiet tension. I had barely slept, running financial projections until 3 a.m., but exhaustion was a luxury I couldn't afford. At exactly 9 a.m., Kingston and his investment team arrived at the Lancaster Fine Foods headquarters. Their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. "Madeline," Kingston began as we settled into the conference room. "I've been in this business for 20 years. And I've learned to trust my instincts. Something happened at that dinner that concerns me." I met his gaze without hesitation. "You're right to be concerned," I said, sliding folders across the table. "Page 1 is our current organizational structure. Page 2 is what I suspect it will look like if my parents have their way after the investment closes." As Kingston flipped the page, his brow furrowed. The second chart showed Ethan as CEO, with me reassigned to a vague, creative director role, one without any real authority. "This isn't what we discussed during our negotiations," Kingston said flatly. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. But it's been the unspoken plan in my family since the day I joined the business. No matter what I achieve, Ethan is the presumed heir." Silence settled over the room. Then Diane Thomas, another key investor, turned to the next page. "And what's on page 3, she asked. I took a deep breath. "That's my counterproposal." The room went still as they studied the document. It outlined a new company structure, one that didn't include my parents or the Lancaster name at all. "This is unexpected," Kingston said carefully. "You're proposing we redirect our investment into a new entity, one that you would lead?" "Yes," I confirmed, meeting his gaze steadily. "And I can show you why that makes financial sense for everyone involved." I clicked through a presentation I had prepared overnight. "Our customer base doesn't connect with the Lancaster name," I explained. "They connect with our product quality, our values, and our brand story, all of which I built." Kingston and his team listened intently as I outlined how our sales had grown, our market position strengthened. I showed them customer surveys where the brand's defining traits, innovation, sustainability, and community connection, were initiatives I spearheaded, not legacy elements from my parents' original business. "What about your manufacturing partnerships?" Thomas asked. "Wouldn't you be starting from scratch?" I shook my head. "Our 3 main manufacturing partners have contract renewals coming up next quarter. I've maintained those relationships personally for years. They know who really runs this business." As the discussion continued, I laid out a complete business plan for a new company, one that would leverage everything I had built but without the family complications. After 2 hours, Kingston leaned back in his chair. "This is impressive work for one weekend," he said. "But I'm guessing you've been thinking about this for much longer." I nodded. "It's been my contingency plan for about 3 years." Kingston exchanged glances with his team. "We'll need to conduct due diligence. But I'm inclined to redirect our investment as you've proposed." Relief washed over me. "Thank you," I said. I was prepared to walk away with nothing if necessary. Kingston shook his head. "That wouldn't serve anyone's interest, least of all ours. But I have one condition." I raised a brow. "Which is, you need to have an honest conversation with your parents before we finalize anything," he said. "Give them a chance to recognize what they're about to lose." I wanted to refuse, to spare myself the inevitable pain of that confrontation. But I knew he was right. "I'll speak with them tonight." That evening, I drove to my parents' house, a strange sense of calm settling over me. For years, I had fought for recognition, believing that if I worked hard enough, proved myself enough, they would finally see me as more than a placeholder for Ethan. But I had been wrong. No amount of success could change how they viewed me. The conversation went exactly as I expected. My mother was horrified that I would even consider walking away from the family legacy. My father, ever the peacemaker, suggested a compromise, that Ethan and I co-lead the company. I've been running this business alone for 8 years. I reminded them, why would I need a co-leader now? Ethan brings fresh perspectives. My mother insisted. He's always had the strongest business mind in the family. Based on what? I asked, struggling to keep my voice level. The consulting job he quit after 2 years? The MBA that I paid for while I was reinvesting my salary into saving this company? The silence that followed told me everything. I took a deep breath. The investors are backing me. Not the family name. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Recognize what I've built. Or lose everything. The next morning, the final decision was made. The investors signed off on a contract keeping me as CEO. While Ethan was given a non-executive role, my parents, defeated, had no choice but to agree. It wasn't the ending I had once dreamed of. But as I walked into my office that day, my team standing beside me, I realized something important. My true family was the one that believed in me. Not the one I was born into. And that was all I needed. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring real-life stories.